Good day all. In this talk, I shall continue my examination of transgenderism by looking at theoretical explanations for this phenomenon. I shall look at all four sociological theories, and I shall throw in some contributions from psychology. I shall begin with the micro or individual level of analysis provided by subjectivism, continue with the meso or group level analysis provided by feminism and structuralism, and conclude with the macro or societal level analysis of Marxism. As always, I argue that each theory is valid on its own level, and that all four theories are needed for a complete picture of this topic. So, first, I shall look at subjectivist theories, which overlap to some extent with psychology. The first sociologist to examine a transgender person was a theorist in the subjectivist tradition, American Harold Garfinkel, who developed the theory of ethnomethodology, which I have examined in my talks on subjectivism. In 1958, he met a person named Agnes, whose case has become quite well known. Agnes had been born a man, but by the time Garfinkel met him, Agnes looked, dressed, and acted like a woman. As I said in my previous talk, prior to the 1980s, virtually all transgender cases were men who wished to become women. Agnes had come to the psychiatry department at UCLA with a specific purpose: to persuade the doctors there to support his request for genital surgery, which at that time was rare and difficult to obtain. Agnes originally self-diagnosed as intersex and claimed that he spontaneously began to become female at puberty. Intersexuals do exist as a genetic anomaly, and such a spontaneous gender change has been documented in a tiny number of people. However, intersexuals form only a small minority of those who declare themselves transgender. Agnes eventually admitted that he was not intersexual, but that he'd been stealing his mother's estrogen tablets and taking them since the age of 12, which was what had actually caused him to grow breasts and appear feminine. Taking such drugs is still generally the first step in the transgender procedure, and eventually Agnes did get his wish for surgery to remove his penis. However, as a sociologist, Garfinkel was not concerned with the biological or psychological aspects of Agnes's condition, but with the social aspects. He focused on the manner in which Agnes passed for female despite being biologically male. In interviews, Agnes told him that looking like a woman was not enough. He also had to learn how to act like a woman in order to be socially accepted as one. From this, Garfinkel drew the conclusion that gender was not just something one was born with. He said people have to, quote, accomplish gender. In other words, gender is not just a biological fact, it is also a social role that everyone has to learn. Society has gender role expectations, which every individual must normally fit into as a man or a woman. Most people adopt those expectations automatically without thinking about it. But Agnes had to consciously learn and mimic the expectations for women. This allowed Agnes to identify and bring out those expectations for Garfinkel. Garfinkel, who at that time was just creating his theory of ethnomethodology, was more concerned with establishing those role expectations than with the transgender aspect of Agnes's story. A central tenet of his ethnomethodology came to be that all social roles have unconscious background assumptions, things that we think and do so often that we've forgotten that they're there. Garfinkel sought to bring these background assumptions into the foreground through measures like his breaching experiments, where his students deliberately breached expectations of normal behavior to see how people would react. Agnes's whole adult life was a breaching experiment, a man who continuously breached male role expectations. At the time, Agnes's condition was so rare that Garfinkel did not think of it as an example of transgenderism. Indeed, the word transgender had not yet been invented, and so Garfinkel was not studying transgenderism. He was interested in what Agnes could tell him about society as a whole, not how a tiny number of persons felt about their gender. In the 60s and 70s, ethnomethodologists and feminists built on Garfinkel's work, bringing out the differences between male and female gender roles. In recent years, more attention has been paid to the psychological roots of transgenderism. Psychologist Jordan Peterson has argued that one of these is narcissism, where the individual falls in love with themselves. Narcissism is a psychological concept, not a sociological one, but it explains the movement's complete self-absorption and utter disregard for others. Transgenderism is all about me. It is about what I want. Nobody else's wishes or needs matter. It is an extension of Western society's traditional value of individualism. But transgenderism takes individualism to a new extreme with the claim that every individual has the right to choose their own gender. The will of the individual supersedes biology, society, reality, and even, if you believe in him, the will of God. The individual, with a little help from the medical establishment, transcends reality and attains godlike power over his or her own body. This is where self-affirmation becomes self-aggrandizement. Transgenderism provides a gender ideology which gives the individual a moral authority over all others. It promotes the belief that I am who and what I say I am, and nobody has the right to say otherwise. This attitude is both antisocial and anti-sociological. Subjectivist sociologists like Irving Goffman have demonstrated that the self is actually established in a process of interaction between the individual and others. Indeed, studies show that some 80% of our personality and behavior is socially negotiated. But narcissists refuse to negotiate. Like Judge Dredd, they declare, I am the law. For them, transgenderism is a way of distinguishing themselves, of making themselves special. Narcissism leads to self-deception for the purpose of self-aggrandizement. Since narcissists are completely self-absorbed, it's relatively easy for them to construct their self-contained gender fantasy world in which they can convince themselves that their mutilated bodies are really beautiful. Like anorexics who are skin and bone but see themselves as fat, they don't see reality when they look in the mirror, but only their own fantasy version of themselves. If anyone refuses to participate in their fantasy, narcissists will commonly fly into a rage or throw a child's tantrum. This is because denying their fantasy demolishes their fragile emotional world. The vehement response of transgender activists to any opposition, a response which invariably contains far more emotion than reason, is just such a tantrum taken to a social level. The bullying tactics which the movement has adopted are another example of the childish mentality which underlies it. These tactics include the campaign to force society as a whole to use their made-up terminology and pronouns, and their efforts to force their way into women's safe spaces. Such controlling behavior is all part of their narcissistic ego trip. Since narcissists see only themselves, the rights of others, such as society's right to freedom of speech or women's right to safety of person, do not enter their thinking. A more sociological explanation for the subjective changes which led to the explosion of transgenderism from the 80s on is that it was connected to changes in Western society's culture and media. Now, I am not one of those who blame everything bad that happens on the media, but I do believe that the media have their role to play in all social developments, good and bad. And so the media have helped to provide one of the subjective roots of transgenderism. In sociological terms, transgenderism is a form of role-playing, playing the role of the other gender. Developments in the media have created new forms of role-playing. Indeed, transgenderism may be defined as extreme LARPing, live-action role-playing. LARPing is a form of role-playing game where the participants dress up and physically portray their characters. It evolved from role-playing board games, first emerged in the late 70s and exploded in popularity in the 80s, just like transgenderism. Since then, video games and internet games like Second Life have taken role-playing beyond real life through the creation of personal avatars or digital self-images. This concept was, of course, popularized by the blockbuster movie Avatar, released in 2009. It is no coincidence that teenagers are the core social group that are into both role-playing games and transgenderism. While some games offer a limited choice of avatars, others are almost infinitely customizable. Through their avatar, a person can become anyone or anything, change their looks, their ethnicity, or their gender. As young people have become accustomed to the idea that they can be anyone they want to be in the electronic media, which make up more and more of their lives, they have also become more likely to believe that they should also have this right in the real world. If they can see themselves as the other gender in their computer screens and cell phones, then why not also in their mirrors? And so, life imitates art. The final explanation I offer for the subjective underpinnings of transgenderism is homosexuality. There can really be no doubt that this is at least a partial explanation for this phenomenon. Many, if not most persons, who for a time believe that they are transgender eventually decide that they're actually homosexual. Since homosexuality is a minority sexual preference, or in social terms, a minority subculture, it is almost inevitable that homosexuals will go through a period of confusion before realizing that they belong to this minority rather than the heterosexual majority. At this time, around puberty, transgenderism will appear to them as an option. Since homosexuality still carries a social stigma for some, there are those who prefer to believe that they are in the wrong body rather than admit to themselves that they are homosexual. Unfortunately, by the time many of them realize the truth, they have had irreversible surgery. I move on now to look at feminist theory. Since the overwhelming majority of those going through the transgender procedure are teenage girls, this is very much a feminist issue. One question which feminists address is, why should the onset of puberty end transgenderism in boys, but trigger it in girls? Perhaps there's a biological reason, but no research has yet uncovered one. Feminists, on the other hand, point to a clear social reason. At puberty, girls become young women. As such, they feel, for the first time, the enormous pressure that our culture puts on young women to be sexy. These days, being sexy is no longer just about putting on attractive clothes and makeup. It's about changing the female body. At first through diets, but increasingly through various forms of surgery. Liposuction, rhinoplasty, breast augmentation, and so on. Transgender surgery, which, like these other measures, is a form of cosmetic surgery, is just an extension of this trend. Young men who do not experience this social pressure to change their bodies do not come to feel negatively about their bodies, and so have all such forms of surgery much less frequently. As an extension of this, young men have no problem with becoming old men in their time. But young women don't want to become old women because they are no longer sexy. Transgenderism allows young women to abandon their female bodies before they grow old and supposedly unattractive. As feminists like Naomi Wolf have established, our culture has created a beauty myth which makes young women feel worthless if they're not beautiful. It has done this partly by bombarding teenage girls with ads and other media products which feature digitally enhanced women with perfect faces and bodies, making many real girls feel ugly and inadequate by comparison. Studies have shown that for many teenage girls, puberty is accompanied by a sharp decline in self-esteem and a rise in self-loathing, particularly by hating their bodies. Transgenderism offers a potential escape from this mental pain and social pressure by no longer being a woman. Moreover, transgenderism offers a perverse form of punishment and revenge against the hated body by getting the female body parts cut off. Breasts, which symbolize womanhood in our culture more than any other body part, are usually the first to go in the surgical component of the transgender process. As an example, Chloe Cole has stated that she first began to think of herself as a boy when she became aware of the uncomfortable and painful aspects of being a woman, like menstruation, pregnancy, and childbirth. Transgenderism became, for her, an escape route from the pains of womanhood, which was then promoted by a group she encountered online and later by doctors. She's also said that the transgender persons she met online invariably had a tale of trauma to tell. Sexual assault, family abuse, depression, ADHD, or, like herself, being diagnosed on the autistic spectrum. Any of these could lead to a rejection of the person's own body and a turn to transgenderism. In addition, teenage girls are the segment of the population that most craves social attention and approval. While transgenderism may once have carried a social stigma, in the late 20th century it became the exact opposite. By declaring themselves transgender, girls who were ordinary, uninteresting, and ignored by most of their compatriots suddenly found themselves to be the center of attention and treated like local celebrities. For many teenage girls, this rise in popularity is worth any associated health risks. Rebelling against their parents with such a declaration is just an added bonus. Gender also explains the change in transgenderism from an individual phenomenon to a group phenomenon. Women form groups more readily than men, especially teenagers, and women share their problems more readily than men, especially teenagers. Many studies have shown that teenage girls are the segment of the population with the highest rates of anxiety, depression, mental illness, self-harm, eating disorders, and suicide attempts. This is partly because, as personality testing has established, women are more compassionate and empathic than men. Women identify with others' suffering more than men. So, when a group of teenage girls get together and share their stories of teen angst, they feel each other's pain and it is magnified. Their own empathy works against them, causing them more pain. Then, when one announces that she has discovered that she is transgender and this makes her feel better, they all seize on this explanation and supposed solution to their problems. The idea spreads in a process which has been termed psychological contamination, social contagion, or a psychic epidemic. In sociological terms, it consists of the swift creation of a counterculture. To put it simply, they talk each other into it. This process has been observed in fringe social groups from street gangs to religious cults, but it spreads most easily and quickly among groups of teenage girls. They are not only the ones most likely to create such groups, they are also the most likely to go along with the views of the group. The internet has, of course, made the formation of these groups much easier and more prevalent. Such groups have been found to spread other forms of self-harm among teenage girls, such as eating disorders, cutting or slashing their bodies, and even suicide attempts. It is no coincidence that both slashing and transgenderism are overwhelmingly engaged in by young women. Studies have shown that when dealing with pain and anger, men hurt others, women hurt themselves. Another way in which women do so is through eating disorders, like anorexia nervosa and bulimia, which are also overwhelmingly female ailments, and which are common among young women and teens who come to believe that they are transgender. This again is no coincidence. Eating disorders and transgenderism are both coping strategies used by the same teenage girls to deal with the psychological pain they are feeling. One final point made by feminists. Since most of those who go through transgender surgery are women, the procedure is in practice simply a more sophisticated version of the old African custom of female genital mutilation. This has ruined the lives of millions of women in sub-Saharan Africa, and the United Nations has been fighting to eradicate it for decades. But how can the West claim the moral high ground on this issue when it also cuts out women's genitals, just using more advanced surgical technology? Moving on now to structuralist theory, I shall begin with the work of Emile Durkheim. Since transgenderism did not exist in Durkheim's day, he never wrote anything about it. However, his ideas can still be applied to this issue because Durkheim spent quite a bit of time studying suicide and other forms of self-harm, in which I include transgenderism. He concluded that their cause was not so much psychological as social. He argued that such actions were caused by an absence of meaningful social ties, or a state of social isolation, which, in French, he termed anomie. He said that levels of anomie have grown because modern industrial society individualizes and isolates people. We live surrounded by millions of people, but we have an emotional connection to very few of them. This particularly affects groups in an uncertain social position, such as teens. Teens are neither child nor adult. They're persons trying to decide who they are and what they want to do with their lives. Their problem is that establishing an adult career path also involves establishing an adult gender role, because all societies have a gender division of labor to some extent. For example, men are more aggressive than women, so most soldiers are men. Women are more nurturing than men, so most nurses are women. However, there are female soldiers and male nurses, and they do not require surgery to validate their choice of an occupation that falls outside their traditional gender role. Being in the minority does not make them wrong or unnatural or in need of corrective surgery. The existence of minorities is just as normal and natural as the existence of majorities. Teen anomie and teen angst are normal. The teenage years are a period of transition between childhood and adulthood. The teen's social role and social responsibilities are being redefined, whether they like it or not. The process of growing up normally involves some isolation, confusion, and mental pain. Nobody likes being in pain, but sometimes it is necessary. As the saying goes, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Teen angst is part of every person's preparation for the trials and tribulations of adulthood. It's a phase which everyone eventually grows out of. However, today, we often don't have the patience for this because we live in the world of the quick fix. If you're in pain, you should immediately take a pill. And if that doesn't work, you should have surgery. As I've said in previous talks, cuts and chemicals, or surgery and pharmaceuticals, are the basic techniques of modern medicine. And so, of course, they've been applied to the problem of transgenderism. Instead of allowing teenagers to grow up and figure out who they are naturally, we're putting 14-year-olds through irreversible surgery. Even therapy takes longer and requires much more effort from the individual than just getting an anesthetic and waking up fixed, in both senses of the word, by the surgeon. Young persons who have transgender surgery are not heroes, they're victims. More precisely, they're victims of child abuse. When 14 and 15-year-old children are pressured into having radical and irreversible surgery, which may cause them a lifetime of health problems, then this is child abuse. Of course, everyone would rather see themselves as a hero than a victim, which is why transgender persons self-identify as fighters on the front lines of the struggle for human rights. But this self-glorification cannot just be accepted at face value. Adults, especially those in authority, have the responsibility to look after children, including teens, because they frequently do things which are harmful to themselves simply because they don't know any better. As Rachel Liu said in her review of When Harry Became Sally, quote, "It's hard to tell children no, but ultimately kids suffer far more when adults aren't willing to be adults." Yet this is the present situation. Our authority figures have decided to abandon their adult responsibilities in the name of political correctness and being woke. Not only do they not prevent teens from mutilating their own bodies, they support and enable it. Political correctness has turned society's priorities upside down, to the point where not offending the mentally ill is seen as more important than actually looking after their physical and mental well-being. Much of Western society has apparently decided that not hurting someone's feelings is more important than not cutting off their genitals. Now, I value politeness as much as the next Canadian, but it's not as important as preserving your health and your body parts. Self-mutilation is not a human right. It is a symptom of mental illness and suffering. In North American prisons, self-mutilation is rampant, especially among women inmates, through methods like slashing one's own body. The reason for this is that prison creates extreme anomie. It cuts inmates off from all normal social contact, causing psychological pain, which the physical pain of slashing distracts them from. Teens may live in a self-imposed prison, cutting themselves off from society, and so similarly, cutting into their own bodies, whether through slashing or surgery or both, appears to them as a solution to the psychological problems and emotional pain which this causes. Slashing is just one of the mental disorders which have been found to be widespread among transgender teens. The ultimate form of self-harm is, as Durkheim said, suicide. While persons may commit suicide at any age, by far the highest risk age group is teenagers. This is why we have teen suicide hotlines, not middle-aged suicide hotlines. Do transgender persons have high suicide rates? Oh yes. Indeed, studies in several Western countries have found that transgender persons have staggeringly high suicide rates of between 30 and 50%. As far as I'm concerned, this single statistic completely disproves all transgenderist claims that the procedure is in any way mentally or physically beneficial to its recipients. How can the procedure make people happier in their own bodies when nearly half of those who go through it commit suicide? Transgender activists have proposed that these high suicide rates are due to negative social reaction, particularly from family and friends. In other words, the transgender person's problems, as usual, are all blamed on transphobia. However, this argument, like most transgender reasoning, is self-contradictory. It proposes that the individual, at first, completely ignores disapproval and opposition from family and friends and goes through the transgender procedure. But that having done so, she or he suddenly switches to being so affected by the same disapproval from the same people that she or he commits suicide. Surely, if the opinions of their loved ones mattered so much to them, they would never have gone through the transgender procedure in the first place. It is transgenderism, not opposition to transgenderism, that causes these suicides. Indeed, I would argue that transgenderism is itself a form of suicide, which I would term gender suicide. Transgender surgery cannot make anyone into the other gender, but it can kill the gender a person was born as. Cutting a man's penis off does not make him into a woman, but it does ensure that he is no longer a functioning man. It takes the ancient practice of castration, which entailed cutting off the testicles but not the penis, to new extremes. This procedure then effectively consists of killing off the person you are in the hope of becoming a completely different person, one in less pain. Like all suicide attempts, It is a cry of pain and despair and a cry for help. However, this help should not consist of letting the person go through with their gender suicide any more than we should let teens go through with complete suicide. Real help should consist of therapy which eases the person's mental pain, not just enabling them to hit the eject button on their lives. Given their situation of social uncertainty, it is inevitable that teens have identity issues, including gender identity issues. Frankly, every teenager in the world might as well walk around with the words, "Who am I?" tattooed on their foreheads. In pre-industrial societies, this was not such a problem, because most people just followed in their parents' footsteps. If you wanted to know where your life was going, you just had to look at your parents. But of course, this no longer applies to most people. Everyone is expected to be an individual, to be themselves, whoever that is. While individualism, of course, has its positive aspects, one of its problems is that it can lead to social isolation or anomie. Today's teens are so busy being themselves that they're incapable of forming real social relationships. Many teens have no real friends and cannot communicate with their parents. They fill this void with the internet. They obsessively follow social media, podcasts, and other internet media, and form virtual relationships with people that they never actually meet. However, virtual relationships are not real relationships. While screen faces and text can provide information, they cannot provide an emotional connection. Nobody really cares about screen faces. But despite its emotional emptiness, the internet can still bring peer group pressure to bear on the individual. Even though it is a global medium, the internet in practice breaks down into many in-group subcultures. Like-minded persons get together and form so-called echo chambers, where they reinforce each other's thinking and exclude all divergent opinions. The transgender movement has come to form just such an in-group. When confused teens turn to the internet for answers about their identity, this is one group that many encounter. This group spreads the message that if you're confused about your gender identity, which in practice virtually all teens are, then it's probably because you're in the wrong body. If the individual makes contact with such a group, they are strongly urged to believe that they are transgender. Persons willing to make this claim are lauded as heroes who are incredibly brave for making this choice. Just as with religious cults, they're told repeatedly that joining the group will solve all their problems and provide them with happiness. In this way, naturally questioning and confused teens are sucked in and converted to the cult of transgenderism. In his documentary, What is a Woman?, Matt Walsh addressed the transgender community bluntly. Quote, "You're all child abusers. You prey upon impressionable children and indoctrinate them into your insane ideological cult. A cult which holds many fanatical views, but none so deranged as the idea that boys are girls and girls are boys." Is it fair to call transgenderism a cult? Well, as I've said, there is no objective evidence for it. It exists solely because its supporters believe it exists. A position based on belief or faith is religion, not science. And since transgenderism is not a church, that makes it a cult. It operates in classical cult fashion, seeking out disaffected teens and offering them a new family which truly understands them in return for their loyalty. It presents transgenderism as, in effect, a holy cause deserving of their devotion. Those who become transgender have also been found to act like cult members. That is to say, they turn away from mainstream society even more and interact almost exclusively with other transgender persons, explaining away their mutual health problems and constantly reaffirming to each other that they have made the right choice. In case you doubt that such groups can convince individuals to engage in self-harm, consider the existence of suicide bombers who kill themselves to further the cult's cause, whatever that may be. On a larger scale, we also have the examples of places like Jonestown and Waco, Texas, where whole groups committed mass suicide because their cult leaders told them to. If cult groups can persuade individuals to blow themselves to pieces or drink poisoned Kool-Aid, then they can persuade them to surgically mutilate their own bodies. Cults are also, of course, notoriously hostile to non-believers. The transgender movement certainly fits this criterion also. As I said, it has organized systematic campaigns of vilification against its critics and has even pressured employers into job dismissals and the closure of clinics. Like all cults, it is harmful to its members and its opponents alike. It physically mutilates its members and socially mutilates its opponents. The transgender procedure operates in practice as a rite of passage. It demonstrates the individual's commitment to the group, acting as an extreme form of hazing and separating the individual from the rest of society. All of this evidence leads me to the inescapable conclusion that what started out as a children's mental disorder has now evolved into a dangerous cult. The operation of cults has also been explained by Durkheim's anomie. Cults seek out persons who have lost their social connections, such as teenagers in general and teen runaways in particular. Traditionally, this has been done by sending recruiters to places like bus and train stations. But increasingly, these days, it's done over the internet. The cult offers an immediate end to the unhappiness of anomie by providing a whole group with whom the individual can instantly establish social connections. Suddenly, you have all these new friends. Everyone is positive, supportive, and treats you as a new family member, as long as you go along with whatever the cult says. However, the cult also isolates its members from the rest of society. Cult members are close to each other, but distant from everyone else. For this reason, they reduce anomie in one way, but increase it in another. Over the long term, the in-group is not enough. The individual needs to reconnect to society as a whole. The problem for transgender persons is that it's difficult to do so once you've had irreversible surgery, which makes you physically different from most people, both male and female. If the root cause of all forms of self-harm, including slashing, eating disorders, alcoholism, drug abuse, transgenderism, and suicide, is anomie, or social isolation, then the only real cure for these problems is for the individual to establish or re-establish meaningful social ties, relationships which provide an emotional connection, above all establishing that other people care about them. For their own mental health, people need to connect to other people on an emotional as well as a practical level. People need to connect to family, friends, and workmates, as well as larger social groups like persons of a similar profession, religion, or nationality to themselves. The transgender movement can provide some social connections, but it breaks far more than it makes. In historical terms, transgenderism is just the latest of countless harmful social crazes. Whenever anomie reaches high levels in society, groups of people seize on irrational beliefs and harm themselves and others. Examples of such historical crazes include laughing manias, dancing manias, self-flagellation, witch hunts, and even mass suicides. A particularly close comparison may be made with the Salem witch trials, which also began with a children's fantasy that spread throughout a community and ended with the execution of 25 innocent people. Social movements rise and fall on a social timetable, which is longer than an individual lifespan. And so, these crazes normally last for decades or even centuries and damage or destroy the lives of thousands of people before expiring of their own self-destructiveness. History teaches us that this will similarly be the fate of transgenderism. It is not a permanent aspect of human sexuality. It is just a passing fad. The transgender procedure was invented less than a century ago. In social terms, that still makes it a novelty. But when the novelty fades away, so will transgenderism. As with all such fads, once it passes, society as a whole will have difficulty believing that people could ever have gone along with such madness. I can just imagine future conversations. So, you're saying that people actually used to get their genitals cut off? By the thousands? And millions more encouraged them to do it? Thank goodness we no longer live in such ignorant and barbaric times. Unfortunately, we still do. We move on now to look at the fourth and last sociological theory, Marxism. For Marxists, all modern social developments are at root about capitalism and making money. So, is transgenderism about making money? You can bet your bottom dollar it is. Money is the main explanation for why transgenderism, after being a tiny trickle for most of the 20th century, suddenly exploded in the early 80s. What changed to trigger this explosion? Just one thing. President Ronald Reagan privatized US healthcare. There are more transgender organizations and possibly more transgender persons in the US than in the rest of the world put together. For example, the US's total population is about 8 times that of Canada, but its transgender population is about 24 times that of Canada. Without the US's massive expansion in private medicine, transgenderism would not exist as a social phenomenon today, certainly not on the scale to which it does. Public health care has no interest in expanding the scope of a system that is chronically underfunded and already under great strain. But private medicine always wants to medicalize society ever more so as to increase its profits. To this end, private medical practitioners have a long and well-established tradition of promoting medical procedures and medications which are eventually proven to be either completely useless or actually harmful. Thalidomide is perhaps the best known example of this, a supposedly safe drug which caused horrific birth defects. Transgenderism is just another on this long list. Transgenderism is already making medical practitioners in the US tens of millions of dollars a year, and that figure is climbing swiftly. Anything that makes that much money is welcomed by capitalism with open arms, regardless of any negative consequences it has for the health of patients. It is in the financial interest of private medical practitioners to claim that the so-called cure to their problems consists of a series of very expensive medical procedures. Of course, this also means that in addition to their health problems, persons who've gone through this process can also expect massive medical bills, crippling debt, and often bankruptcy. Moreover, since part of these medical bills are paid for by health insurance, and since that insurance will only pay for accepted medical procedures, transgenderism may also be defined as an elaborate insurance fraud. In practical terms, the principal goal of the transgender movement is to obtain the insurance accreditation without which transgenderism could not exist. Appeals for support from politicians and the general public are ultimately just means to this financial end. Without insurance, transgenderism would be far too expensive a luxury for any but the rich, and the rich have better things to spend their money on. If health insurance, both private and public, determined that this was not a valid medical procedure and stopped funding it, as they should, then transgenderism would virtually disappear overnight. I've previously argued that transgenderism may be compared to eating disorders like anorexia. But these ailments have been given very different receptions by the medical establishment, particularly in the US. In the late 20th century, anorexia, where a person sees themselves as fat even though they're skeletal, and essentially starves themselves to death, began to spread. The root cause of this was a culture and a media that told young girls over and over that you can never be too rich or too thin. Soon enough, the internet began to feature anorexic in-groups who claimed that this was not an illness, just a lifestyle choice. They argued that they should have the right to do whatever they wished with their own bodies, and even posted photos of persons who'd been reduced to skin and bone with the accompanying claim that they were beautiful. While eating disorders continue, this movement has faded, partly because it failed to gather support from the medical establishment. Doctors quite rightly said that this was not a human right, but rather a serious and sometimes fatal illness. While exactly the same may be said of transgenderism, most doctors have not said so. For American doctors in particular, the difference between anorexia and transgenderism may simply be that it's difficult for them to make money from people whose problem is that they have virtually stopped eating, but easy for them to make money out of people who want major surgery and drugs. While I readily admit that this is a very cynical view of the medical profession, there is no shortage of evidence that medical professionals, especially private US medical corporations, routinely put profits before patients. If a person wants a medical procedure and has the money to pay for it, they will perform it, even if it is medically unnecessary and possibly harmful. Teenagers are currently going through the transgender procedure without even a reference from a doctor or a psychiatrist, just on the basis of their own self-diagnosis. This complete lack of oversight represents a massive failure of responsibility on the part of both medical professionals and the state. 14-year-olds are by law not permitted to drink, drive, or vote, but purely on their own say-so, they're being permitted to initiate irreversible surgery. The result of this situation is the emergence of a growing number of people who regret having the transgender procedure, often very quickly. The movement has claimed that less than 1% of those who go through the procedure go on to detransition. But like most of the claims made by the movement, this is simply false. There are now thousands of detransitioners who've tried to get the transgender procedure reversed as much as they can. Many blame their doctors for pressuring them into undergoing the procedure. For example, in Britain, Kira Bell came to regret the transgender surgery she had at the age of 15, sued the medical establishment that performed the procedure, and won. The UK High Court of Justice said in its decision that it was, quote, horrified that a teenager had been permitted and even encouraged to make such a decision. The court also found that this procedure had led to no improvements in the physical or mental health of any of the girls who had gone through it. The same conclusion has been arrived at by studies in several countries, including the US, UK, and Sweden. One more example that I've already mentioned. In California, Chloe Cole also had transgender surgery at the age of 15. At 16, she detransitioned, and as of 2023, at the age of just 18, she is also suing the doctors involved on the grounds that they pressured her into it. She and her parents were told that the transgender procedure was the only option for her, and moreover, that if she didn't do it quickly, she would soon become a high suicide risk. Doing some research after the procedure, she discovered that these claims were all false, which is one reason she turned against transgenderism. In particular, as I have said, it is now well documented that going through the transgender procedure does not reduce the risk of suicide, but on the contrary, greatly increases it. Chloe has described the procedure as, quote, like Nazi-era experiments. This is similar to the commentary of Matt Walsh, who described transgender surgery as, quote, Nazi scientist evil. Is it fair to compare the transgender movement to the Nazi movement? Well, there is a clear connection. They both emerged in exactly the same time and place. Germany in the 1920s and 30s. It is no coincidence that both the modern concept of transgenderism and the medical procedure of transgenderism were invented in Nazi-era Germany. Now, the Nazis themselves did not support transgenderism, as it did not fit into their master race ideology. They put homosexuals in concentration camps and shut down the first transgender clinic. This is because Nazism and transgenderism emerged together as competing cults, both basing themselves on unsubstantiated claims about human biology. In the 1930s, Nazism won this competition easily. But over the long term, it is transgenderism which has proven to have more staying power. To understand the connection between them properly, we need to look at the broader social context. After losing the First World War, Germany in the 20s and 30s was a society whose economic, political, and social structures were literally crumbling. In Durkheim's terms, it was one of the most extreme examples of anomie on a social scale in all of world history. Under such circumstances, people will seize on any idea that promises them salvation, no matter how irrational. This included the Nazis' master race ideology, a renewed belief in magic and the occult, and transgenderism. These were all pseudo-scientific ideas which emerged from the same period of social madness. Transgenderism originated in the same medical establishment which just a few years later gave rise to the horrific medical experiments of Dr. Joseph Mengele and others. Slicing and dicing the human body seemed like a reasonable idea at the time. Even though the Nazis did not support it, transgenderism is still an invention of Nazi Germany. So, describing transgenderism as Nazi-era experiments is not just a comparison, it is the literal truth. The position that transgenderism is a dangerous experiment is also now supported, in slightly less dramatic terms, by the American College of Pediatricians, which recently issued a statement that, quote, "The treatment of gender dysphoria in childhood with hormones effectively amounts to mass experimentation on and sterilization of youth who are cognitively incapable of providing informed consent. There is a serious ethical problem with allowing irreversible, life-changing procedures to be performed on minors who are too young to give valid consent themselves, adolescents who cannot understand the magnitude of such decisions." Similarly, the Italian Psychoanalytic Society recently expressed, quote, "serious concerns over the use of puberty-blocking chemicals on teens, noting that such, quote, current experimentation has no established scientific basis and is instead based solely on the self-evaluation of teens whose sexual development is still ongoing and who therefore cannot possibly know what their adult gender identity will be." The Society notes that such blockers are not the simple pause button on sexual development that the transgender movement has claimed, but that on the contrary they can do serious harm to the individual's health. The health risks of the transgender procedure greatly outweigh any purported and unsubstantiated benefits. The Society also notes that every single scientific study shows that a majority of teens who declare themselves transgender abandon such claims before they reach adulthood. Statistics vary from country to country, ranging from 60% to 98% abandonment rates. But in every case, they are a majority. To put it simply, it's just a phase. Left alone, most teens will grow out of it before they reach adulthood. As scientific evidence mounts that the transgender procedure provides no health benefits and many health hazards, the tide has turned, and a growing international consensus is emerging against performing the procedure on teens. Just over the past year, health authorities in Italy, Sweden, Finland, Germany, the UK, Canada, the US, and possibly other countries that I'm not aware of, have all come out against performing such procedures. The implementation of such a ban would not just put a pause on transgender procedures, it would virtually eliminate them. Close to 90% of such procedures are initiated by teens. And as I just said, the majority of these persons will never undergo the procedure if they can just get through their troubled teenage years and attain their adult gender identity. What this international development tells us is that despite the transgender movement's temporary successes at blocking genuine scientific investigation of this issue, the scientific community is gradually coming to the conclusion that child sex change is harmful, misguided, and immoral. Over the long term, the truth will out. However, For now, this procedure is still being done to many teens. And so, Chloe Cole is actively working to prevent other teens from being pressured into making the same mistake she did. After meeting fellow transgender critic and retired therapist Jordan Peterson, she said that she wished she could have talked to such a therapist when she was younger, because then she might well not have gone through the procedure. One final example of regret over transgenderism. In Massachusetts, a 32-year-old man has said that he was, quote, brainwashed into having his penis surgically removed, and that he wishes he could get it back. He says that staff at the surgical center did not warn him about the negative effects of the surgery because that was, quote, bad for business. Once more, we see that money is one of the main motivators for the rise in transgender procedures. However, while Marxism and the left has been very critical of private healthcare, it has been supportive of transgenderism. Why should this be? Well, as with the other social movements I mentioned earlier, transgenderism has piggybacked on the left and twisted it for its own purposes. Left-wingers who see themselves as socially progressive normally support all struggles for minority rights on general principles, and as such, most of them support transgenderism. However, in their efforts to be woke, such persons have betrayed their own basic principles. Supporting transgenderism means supporting the corporations that left-wingers normally see as the enemy. It means helping those corporations make multi-million-dollar profits from medical procedures for which there is far more evidence that they harm patients than that they benefit them. It puts left-wingers in the position of collaborating with those who put profits before people. The current postmodernist trend, which sees everyone as being right for themselves, has promoted a transition on the left from Karl Marx's materialism, which focused on what is objectively happening in society, to an extreme subjectivist relativism, which respects and supports everyone's beliefs, even if they involve self-mutilation. Postmodernism provides the philosophical basis for transgenderism with a claim that everyone has the right to define themselves. That includes defining themselves as male, female, some other imaginary gender, or even another species. Matt Walsh's children's book, Johnny the Walrus, shows the absurdity of this by allegorically comparing transgenderism to pretending to be a walrus. But for postmodernists, subjective definitions matter more than objective reality. The trouble is, reality doesn't care what people think. People are objectively born either male or female, no matter what they may subjectively think of themselves. Transgenderism demonstrates one of the absurdities of postmodernism. If everyone is right, then the views of the mentally ill are just as valid as the views of the sane. This reasoning literally leads to madness. Marx would never have agreed that everyone is right for themselves. On the contrary, he explicitly said that most people lived in a deluded state of false consciousness created by capitalist ideology, which he sought to bring them out of by showing them the truth of their social situation. He could never have imagined that one day this false consciousness would even extend to a denial of one's own gender. In the 19th century, Marx famously said that religion was, quote, the opiate of the people, part of capitalist ideology. But today in the Western world, fewer and fewer people believe in religion. So instead, capitalism has incorporated a variety of new cult-like beliefs into its ruling ideology. Marxist Herbert Marcuse argued that capitalism does this with all new cultural developments. And it has already done so with the woke subculture and political correctness. Capitalism has made political correctness profitable, and woke has already passed its best before date as a force for progressive social change. Instead, we have entered the age of woke capitalism. This ideology has become so subtle and complex that even left-wingers who are looking for it often do not see it. This is the case with transgenderism, which is a very small part of this ideology. It makes corporations money, and it also promotes a reliance on the technological marvels that only those corporations can provide, like transgender surgery. The implication is that we should all look to corporations and their technology to solve all of our problems, and that only capitalism can provide these solutions. Left-wingers need to return to their roots, meaning, above all, the struggle with the rich, instead of getting diverted into issues such as gender identity and sexual preference. A focus on minority rights has led many left-wingers to forget that the original intent of the left was not to protect the rights of minorities, but to protect the rights of the majority of society from being taken from them by a rich minority. Not all minorities deserve the support of the left. Issues like transgenderism, which affects less than 1% of the population, are ultimately just red herrings dangled by capitalism to distract the general public from the vastly larger social problems which capitalism causes, such as inequality, unemployment, and poverty. Individualism has always been a part of capitalist ideology, and fighting for the rights of the individual has, from its very origins, been a means whereby capitalism has undermined collective action as part of a broader divide and rule strategy. Nobody will get together with their neighbours and engage in collective struggle, which could actually change society, when everyone is busy being themselves. Transgenderism is just a new spin on this old ideological trick, fragmenting society further. Now, as Marcuse said, capitalist ideology generally works through incorporation, exaggeration, and distortion, rather than outright fabrication. So, it is possible that there is a kernel of truth to transgenderist claims, and that some persons have a genuine medical need for transgender surgery. Some persons who go through the transgender procedure are happy and claim that it has brought them peace. However, to the best of my knowledge, there is no scientific evidence that this is an objective medical condition as opposed to a psychological delusion. If there are any persons with such a condition, they're a small minority of those who have it done. Most do so due to social pressure and brainwashing, for which there is far more evidence. This is why the majority of those who go through the transgender procedure eventually either detransition or commit suicide. As I said before, recent studies have concluded that as many as 98% of people grow out of transgenderism naturally. Maybe this means that the last 2% are genuinely helped by having the transgender procedure. Maybe. But while transgender surgery may possibly, but not necessarily, help a tiny number of people, it definitely harms many more. Persons who see transgenderism as a human right are doubtless well-intentioned, but the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Supporting persons' right to mutilate their own bodies is not social progress. It is giving in to mental illness and profiteering. Insanity is not a human right. Receiving proper treatment for mental illness is the true human right. And that is what the movement is denying its members. So, is transgenderism a human rights issue? Certainly it is. Humans have the right to live without being pressured into getting surgically mutilated, having their genitals amputated, having their freedom of speech pushed aside, abandoning rationality and believing that boys are girls, accepting blatant untruths as factual, having their children indoctrinated into a dangerous cult, being vilified and even fired from their jobs for refusing to go along with the fantasies of a mentally ill minority, or having potentially dangerous men allowed into women's safe spaces. The claim that the transgender movement supports human rights is just another of the movement's endless stream of self-serving lies. The reality, as with almost everything the movement says, is the exact opposite. It directly attacks human rights in multiple ways. Instead of seeking proper treatment for their mental illness, the transgender movement is trying to make society as a whole as mentally ill as they are. It's trying to force those who live in the real world to live in their fantasy world instead. The legal support for transgenderism is literally a case of putting the inmates in charge of the asylum. It is allowing mentally ill teenagers to establish government policy and make the law. Transgenderism should not be supported. It should be criminalized, at the very least, up to the age of 18, to protect confused young people from rapacious medical corporations and cult leaders. Sweden and Finland have already banned transgender procedures on minors, and pressure is mounting from healthcare professionals in other countries, including Britain and Canada, to follow suit, with some success. The British government recently announced its intention to ban transgender procedures on persons under 18 years of age. In Canada, The government of Ontario already did so in 2015. And on a national scale, the Campaign Life Coalition is circulating a petition calling on the federal government to enact similar legislation. I have signed this petition, and I have provided a link to the petition if you wish to do likewise. In conclusion, then, there is in reality no such thing as transgenderism or transition surgery. There is only surgical neutering. Surgery can cut off the gender you were born with, but it cannot give you a new gender. Anyone who goes through this surgery, male or female, can never have children and can only have sex with difficulty. Transgenderism is a delusion which has been put to the service of capitalism. Transgenderism supports capitalism objectively by making medical corporations millions of dollars, and subjectively by making the ruling ideology more subtle and complex. Like capitalist culture in general, it supposedly helps individuals to be themselves while actually helping the rich to get richer. It ruins the physical and mental health of confused teenagers in order to make money. It is child abuse for profit. Just because it can be done does not mean that it should be done. The incorporation of many left-wingers as supporters of this concept shows just how effective capitalist ideology has become in the age of the internet and woke capitalism. I should like to finish up with some personal observations. In giving this talk, I find myself in a very unusual situation. I'm a sociologist, and that means that I am committed to two things. First and foremost, I'm committed to science. Sociology is a social science. I am a social scientist, and all of my talks have presented scientific facts, figures, and theories. However, when it comes to transgenderism, science is inconclusive. Much more research is needed on both the potential biological and social causes of transgenderism before science can say anything definitive. The problem is that valid research is currently almost impossible to conduct, since most scientific journals have bowed to pressure from the transgender movement and refuse to publish any research or articles which present findings that contradict the transgender activists. As a result, since they only hear the movement's propaganda, at present the majority of scientists support transgenderism. I find myself in disagreement with them, primarily because, even though there is much about transgenderism that we do not understand, we already know enough to say that most of the claims made by transgender proponents are a tissue of lies, beginning with the claim that it is medically possible to change a person into the other gender. Science is supposed to be about establishing the truth. But in these postmodernist times, when everyone supposedly has their own truth, being factual has become less important than being politically correct for many scientists, but not for me. Ultimately, my opposition to the concept of transgenderism boils down to this: it's just not true. Secondly, Like most sociologists, I am what most people would consider left-wing. Since this talk is all about self-identification, I should point out that I do not see myself that way. I see myself, as I said, as a scientist. And it just so happens that scientific facts and figures support the left's analysis of society more than the right's. If the facts supported the right, I'd be a right-winger. But, as most sociologists would agree, for the most part, they do not. So, for practical purposes, I normally side with left-wingers on social issues. But not so here. The left has mostly embraced transgenderism, but I have not. Most of the non-sociological sources I have cited in this talk are conservative or right-wing, persons with whom I would normally disagree, but not this time. This is because I do not see this issue as a debate between right and left. I see it as a debate between sanity and insanity. I see myself as agreeing with the views of the rational rather than those of the mentally ill. The struggle against the transgender movement is not only a fight to save the health and even the lives of thousands of young people, it is literally a battle to preserve the sanity of society as a whole. Once you get people to believe that boys are girls, you can get them to believe any madness. But I refuse to say that boys are girls or that insanity is sanity. However, at least for now, this also means that on this issue, I'm a scientist who disagrees with most scientists and a leftist who disagrees with most leftists. What this tells you, I would submit, is that my position is not based on any prior ideological commitment or on peer group pressure, but on the facts of the matter. Fortunately for me, science is not a democracy. Scientific facts are not established by majority vote, but by years of research and hard work. For example, the world is not and never was flat, no matter how many people think or thought it was. So, holding a position which is in the minority, at least for now, does not make me incorrect. Every new theory has to be held by a minority before it can be held by the majority. And support for my position is growing as more data becomes available, despite the transgender movement's best efforts at censorship and intimidation. I'd like to conclude by making one thing clear. In my talks, I've spoken against the concept of transgenderism, but not against the people going through the transgender procedure. My podcast is not a forum for hate speech, quite the opposite. Of course I support the right of transgender persons, like all persons, to live their lives free of harassment, discrimination, and violence. Persons with this mental illness, as with all mental illnesses, deserve compassion, not persecution. They need to be helped, not harmed. They're victims, not perpetrators. I, and the other analysts who've spoken out against transgenderism, some of whom I've mentioned in my talks, are trying to look out for the best interests of these persons. We are trying to prevent confused teenagers from making the biggest mistake of their lives. We are the ones who are really on their side. Now, you may say that people always know what's best for themselves. But the mounting statistics of self-harm and suicide attempts, especially among teenagers, say otherwise. More and more stories are emerging of persons who, as adults, now deeply regret their teenage decision to undergo transgender surgery. If my talks can help to prevent even one young person from making such a disastrous mistake, then they will have done more to help the real-life people involved in this than all of those fighting for their abstract right to self-mutilation. It is for this reason that I have chosen to post these talks, even though I know they may provoke yet another trademark hate campaign from the transgender movement. Indeed, one of the reasons that I've been able to post these podcasts is that I've already retired. It's too late to get me fired. Frankly, I don't know whether I would have had the courage to risk my job by posting these talks while I was employed at the University of Regina, even though universities are supposed to be bastions of free speech. But as a retired person, I have no job to lose, and I also have no interest in getting this material published in any academic journal, so it doesn't matter to me that it would probably be rejected as transphobic, despite its strictly scientific content. Podcasting, and the internet in general, are making any form of censorship increasingly difficult. However, hate mail is never pleasant to receive. Whether I shall get any remains to be seen. Having posted this talk, all I can do is wait for the hate. It is ironic that the only time in my life I have ever been concerned about such a hate campaign is from a movement which claims to be fighting for human rights. To any listeners who may be considering transgenderism, let me give you one parting piece of advice. Talk to a therapist before you talk to a surgeon. Whatever your problems may be, chopping off body parts is not the solution. That concludes what I have to say on transgenderism. Transcript of this talk is attached if you're interested. Good day.